G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for coming along. We're into session 31, which is only 9 verses, 10 verses, chapter 39, 11 to 20. We're into the section where we're looking at the destruction of Gog, Magog, the armies, the Allied armies, the Confederacy, and where they're destroyed, how they're destroyed, and what happens to them. So let's get into this nice study. So we're coming into now the third unit in this chapter, which comprises verses 11 to 16, and it's dealing now with the 7 months of burying the dead. Before moving into this, we really need to consider a question people often ask: and are the weapons listed here to be taken literally, or are they symbolic of modern military equipment? Well, they might very well be symbolic in one way or another. On the other hand, the invaders might have to, we don't know, the invaders might have to revert to using these ancient weapons for some reason or another. We don't know. On the other hand, though, since Ezekiel did not have the Hebrew words for modern equipment, he'd have to use the words that he was familiar with. So although what he describes are the weapons of ancient warfare, they may describe modern weapons of warfare because, as I said, there's no Hebrew word equivalent for tanks and missiles and rocket launchers and stuff like that. Okay, so the 7 months of burial, looking from verses 11 to 16. It shall come to pass in that day that I will give unto Gog a place for burial in Israel, the valley of them that pass through on the east of the sea, and it shall stop them that pass through. And there shall they bury Gog and all his multitude, and they shall call it the valley of Hamon Gog. In 7 months shall the house of Israel be burying them, that they may cleanse the land. Yes, all the people of the land shall bury them, and it shall be to them a renown in the day that I shall be glorified, says the Lord Jehovah. And they shall set apart men of continual employment, that shall pass through the land, and with them that pass through, those that bury them that remain upon the face of the land, to cleanse it. After the end of 7 months shall they search. And they that pass through the land shall pass through. And when any sees a man's bone, then shall he set up a sign by it till the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamon Gog. And Hamona shall also be the name of a city. Thus shall they cleanse the land. So here we have in these verses 11 to 16, the passage on Gog and Magog now comes to a conclusion, dealing with the 7 months of burial. Verse 11 deals with the place of burial. It says, in that day, meaning in the day that Gog and his army's destruction, I will give unto Gog a place for burial in Israel. So the country that Gog with his forces sought to take over now becomes Gog's graveyard. They thought they would turn Israel into a graveyard for the Jews, but it actually becomes a graveyard for them. And the location of this graveyard is said to be the valley of them that pass through on the east of the sea. So the sea here is the Dead Sea. And so he's dealing with the east side of the Dead Sea, or more specifically, with the Jordan Valley just north of the Dead Sea. So the southern part of the Jordan Valley, around the area where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, will become the place of burial for Gog and his armies. And the result will be, it shall stop them that pass through. So it will create the need for a detour in order to get around this massive cemetery. Because remember that they came upon the land as a cloud that covers the land. It was a massive army, and this massive army has now been dispensed with by God. So there shall they bury Gog and his multitude. And this will give rise to a new name for that part of the Jordan Valley. It says they shall call it the Valley of Hamon Gog. The first part of that name, Hamon, comes from a Hebrew word Hamona, which means multitudes. So in Hebrew, this name reads Gay Hamon Gog, which means the vale or the valley of the multitude of Gog. And that will be the new name given to the area around the northern end of the Dead Sea. Now, verse 12 emphasizes how long it's going to take to bury all the dead corpses. 7 months. shall the house of Israel be burying them. So it sort of gives you an idea of how many need to be buried. Now, the main reason for the burial is that they may cleanse the land. This is in keeping with Numbers 35, verses 33 to 34. Now, verse 13 speaks about the buriers. Yea, all of the people of the land shall bury them. The people of the land, well, they're the Jewish people. Israel is the Jewish people's land. And so it is they who will be doing the burying. It shall be to them a renown in the day that I shall be glorified. So the point of this statement, it shall be a renown, is that the destruction of the invaders is going to result in a new Jewish holy day. Besides the holy days which were instituted by Moses, the Jews have always had a tendency to add further holy days to commemorate great events. And for example, as a result of their deliverance in the days of Queen Esther, there is now the Feast of Purim. Commemoration of the deliverance under the Maccabees is kept on the Feast of Hanukkah, or the Feast of Lights. So today we also have Israeli Independence Day, among other things. And so in the future, when this great army is wiped out by the hand of God, it shall be to them a day of renown. This means it's going to become another Jewish holy day to commemorate God's supernatural deliverance from the hand of Gog and his invading armies. Now, verses 14 to 15 deal with the search for the dead bodies. Verse 14 emphasizes the searching aspect. It says, they shall set apart men of continual employment that shall pass through the land. In other words, men will be hired specifically for the purpose of traveling throughout the land, searching for corpses. And with them that pass through, those that bury them that remain upon the face of the land. So following the scouts who will go looking for the bodies and locating their whereabouts, there will be the burial detail who will then bury those that have been found. And the purpose is again stated here, it's to cleanse the land. The duration is, after the end of 7 months shall they search. So obviously, because of the massive death toll, although there could be a quick initial burial, many of them will fall into various rocky crevices, into places where they could not be easily seen. So it's going to require a 7-month search before they can feel confident they have found them all. Imagine the stench. Now, all those killed in action will eventually be found, but it will take 7 months to locate them all. Now, while verse 14 emphasizes the searching aspect, verse 15 emphasizes the procedure. It will be in 3 stages. First, they that pass through the land shall pass through. So scouts will begin passing through the territory where the army has been destroyed. And second, when any sees a man's bone, then shall he set up a sign by it. Or when a scout sees a bone or a body, he'll set up a visible marker which can be easily spotted. And that will bring him at the 3rd stage, which is till the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamon Gog. And then in verse 16, he now talks about this new city. And Hamona shall also be the name of a city. So this name in Hebrew, like Hamon, means the multitude. So what's going to happen is a new Jewish city will be built, probably on one of the hills looking down upon this valley. And the very name of it will commemorate the multitude that was destroyed by a divine intervention. You know, based upon the location of this burial place, which would be towards the east of the northern end of the Dead Sea, in the southern part of the Jordan Valley, it would put this city in occupied territory today. So the implication, therefore, is that by the time of this invasion, Israel is still hanging on to the West Bank. They may, of course, give it up before this happens, but apparently with this invasion, they'll regain control of it, even if they do give it back. Now, what we've done so far, this has been a verse-by-verse exposition of the prophecy of Gog and Magog, from chapter 38:1 down to 39:16. And the rest of chapter 39, as we're going to see as we proceed through it, does not deal with the Gog and Magog invasion anymore, but rather it deals now with the campaign of Armageddon. And at this point, there is one key question that remains to be answered. The question is, when will this invasion occur? When will it occur? Now, before we get into the various views in it, there are 6 specific textual clues given in chapter 38, verse 8, verse 11, verse 12, and 14 as to the time of this invasion. First of all, it will occur when Israel is once again a state. That's the first thing. Second, it will happen when the Jews have been regathered out of many nations. Third, it will occur when the waste places of many countries are now inhabited again. And fourth, at this point in time, Israel is dwelling in unwalled villages, as in the present day kibbutzim. Fifth, Israel will be dwelling securely. Now, at no time in these 2 chapters has Ezekiel ever said that Israel is dwelling in peace. Rather, they're dwelling securely, which does not necessarily require a condition of peace. Word securely means to be confident, and that is a state in which Israel will be living at the time. She'll be living in confidence in her abilities. And 6, all of the descriptions of Israel in the text are true of modern Israel as it is today. It's exactly what it is today. Now, having said this much, based upon these clues we find in chapter 38, which we have, the question is, when in the prophetic scheme of things will this prophecy be fulfilled? Now, the text does make it clear that it will occur during eschatological times or in the end days, as we saw. But this period actually starts before the tribulation commences, and it includes the tribulation, the millennium, and the aftermath. These are all the end days. Altogether, there are 5 different views about when this invasion will occur. And we're going to go through them one by one, mentioning the supports for each view, and then explain why certain views are incorrect until we get to the correct one. So, when discussing the timing of the invasion, the 7 years, the 7 months must be considered. That's 7 years and 7 months is critical in determining when this takes place. Now, there are 5 major views. And we're going to look at the opposing views looked at first, along with the bases for them, followed by the objections against these positions. And then in conclusion, reasons will be given as to why this invasion would best be viewed as occurring before the tribulation period. So objections to this view will then be answered. So we're going to have the mid-tribulation view, the post-tribulation view, or the end of the tribulation, and then the interlude view, the end of millennium view, and the pre-tribulation view. Now, the mid-tribulation view, this view sees the invasion occurring in the middle of the 7 years of the Great Tribulation. Some of you have seen this image before. That just shows us 7 months of burial, 7 years of burning there. The mid-tribulation view. Okay, this is the first view held by some key teachers of Bible prophecy, and they put in Russian invasion in the middle of the tribulation period. And the support for this position rests upon 2 things. First of all, that Israel dwelling securely means Israel is living during a time of peace, resulting from their covenant with the Antichrist that would have been made 3.5 years earlier. Remember, this is the mid-tribulation view. Second, the second support for this that they have is that this invasion is the same as the invasion of the king of the north in Daniel 11:40, where it is clear that Daniel is speaking of an event which occurs in the middle of the tribulation. So these are the 2 main supports for the mid-tribulation view. Now, this is not the correct position to take in this, and it's for these reasons. First of all, these are the objections. First of all, to dwell securely does not require Israel to be dwelling in peace. There's a difference between living in peace and living securely. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. Second, the question then can be asked, why would God intervene to save Israel at this point and then immediately allow the events of the second half of the tribulation to occur, which includes the absolutely massive persecution of the Jews described in Matthew 24:15 to 28 and Revelation chapter 12, verse 6 to the end of the chapter? Why would God do that? Third, while it is true that the invasion of Daniel 11:40 is an event which occurs in the middle of the tribulation, yet the invasion in Daniel 11:40 is not the same as this one in Ezekiel 38 and 39, for the simple reason that in the book of Daniel, the king of the north is always the king of Syria. Everyone agrees that this is true of all the other references in the book of Daniel. But expounders of this mid-tribulation view want to make Daniel 11:40 the one exception. But consistent interpretation of Daniel simply will not allow us to do that. So the king of the north in Daniel 11 verse 40 is not the same as Gog of the uttermost parts of the north, but rather in Daniel 11:40, the king of the north is Syria. Fourth is the problem of the 7 months. Because if this event occurs in the middle of the tribulation, then the 7 months of burial would now extend into the second half of the tribulation, which is a period when the Jews are fleeing from the land, without having any time to bury their own dead, let alone to bury the dead invaders. And building the new city of Hamona at such a time would be out of the question. So when reading about Israel's massive departure out of the land, recorded in Matthew 24:15 to 22, there's just no time to take 7 months to bury the enemy dead and to build this city as well. Now, this view also has a problem when it comes to the 7 years of burning, because if the Russian invasion occurs in the middle of the tribulation, then these 7 years would have to include the second half of the Great Tribulation, which is 3.5 years, during which time the Jews have been fleeing the land. But it then also would have to continue for a further 3.5 years into the Messianic kingdom. And now the whole concept of burning enemy weapons for 3.5 years into the kingdom is completely inconsistent with the many statements of the Messianic cleansing and renovation of the land on a tremendous, miraculous scale. So to summarize, the main problem with the mid-tribulation view, it does not deal adequately with either the 7 months of burial or the 7 years of burning, because during the second half of the tribulation, the Jews are on the run. They're fleeing for their lives. Now, the other view is the end of or post-tribulation view. So you see it there is happening at the end of the tribulation. Now, post-tribulation or Armageddon view, which is the end of the tribulation here, and this is the second major view, is that the Russian invasion now takes place at the end of the tribulation period. And the key basis of this position is identifying the invasion as the campaign of Armageddon. Now, this campaign will indeed occur at the end of the tribulation. However, those who hold this view, this is that this Gog Magog is Armageddon, those who hold this view believe that Ezekiel 38 to 39 is part of this Armageddon campaign. And they have therefore concluded that the Russian invasion will occur at the end of the tribulation. But Ezekiel 38 to 39 is not part of this campaign. And I'm going to show you why. Here's some examples. We're going to see why. First of all, concerning allies. In Ezekiel 38 to 39, only some nations are allied against Israel. And these same nations are opposed by other nations who protested. But in the campaign of Armageddon, it is all nations, without exception, that comes against the Jews. And this is made very clear by Zechariah 12, 1 to 3, Zechariah 12, 1 to 3, and Zechariah 14, 1 to 2, Zechariah 14, 1 to 2. Second, the direction from which the attack comes is different. In Ezekiel, it only is from the north. But in the campaign of Armageddon, it is from every part of the world against the Jews. Third, There's a difference in purpose. In Ezekiel, the purpose of this invasion is to take the spoil and the prey. But the purpose of the Armageddon campaign is to destroy all of the Jews once and for all. Fourth is the matter of opposition. In Ezekiel 38:13, we pointed out that there'll be other nations protesting this invasion. But in the case of the campaign of Armageddon, there's no protesting whatsoever, because in that campaign, all of the nations of the world come against the Jewish people. Fifth, there is a difference in the manner of destruction. In Ezekiel, it comes by convulsions of nature and divine interference by fire and brimstone out of heaven. But the invasion of Armageddon campaign is destroyed by the second coming of Messiah. Sixth, it concerns the place of destruction. In Ezekiel, this is upon the mountains of Israel. The Armageddon invaders, on the other hand, will be destroyed on a long corridor running all the way from Petra or Bosra, southeast of the Dead Sea, which today is in southern Jordan, to just outside the old city walls of Jerusalem in the valley of Jehoshaphat, or the Kidron Valley. Seventh, the timing of the invasion is different. The Ezekiel invasion is clearly stated to occur when Israel is living in the land securely. The Armageddon campaign occurs while Israel is in flight, in a state of total insecurity and hiding outside the land in Bosra. So these 7 differences between what is happening in Ezekiel 38:1 to 39:16 and the many other passages of scripture which give us the details of the campaign of Armageddon would forbid us making this invasion and the Armageddon invasion one and the same. It's just not possible. Also, this view has a problem with the 7 months of burial and the 7 years of burning. If this invasion occurs at the end of the tribulation in conjunction with the campaign of Armageddon, it would mean Jews would be burying the dead for 7 months into the Messianic kingdom. That's not going to happen. That is, again, inconsistent with what we know about the total renovation, which will happen when the kingdom is set up. It would also mean that the first 7 years of the kingdom would be taken up with burning the weapons of war. Again, this is also inconsistent with the renovation of the earth as described in Isaiah 65:17. Isaiah 65:17. So this second position, where the invasion is deemed to occur at the end of the tribulation, is not the correct one in light of all this evidence. Can't possibly be it. Then we see there is an interlude view. And this is the interlude view, the third view, which puts this invasion between the end of the tribulation and the start of the kingdom. Now, why would they say this? Well, as I said, this is the interlude view. It's between the end of the tribulation, start of the millennial kingdom. Okay? Objections. 2 objections to this view. First of all, the position is now based on the assumption that there will be a period of time between the second coming and the establishment of the millennial kingdom. And such an interlude can be verified from the scriptures. And a number of things will be accomplished before the actual institution of the millennium, such as the judgment of the Gentiles, the resurrection of the Old Testament and tribulation saints, etc. Now, the problem is that if this view is to be consistent, it must make this interlude 7 years long. Yet Daniel chapter 12, verse 12, limits it to just 75 days. The second half of the tribulation is declared to be 42 months or 1,260 days or 3.5 years. Daniel 12:7 refers to it as a times and a half. That's 3.5 years. Daniel 12:11 states that there'll be a total of 1,290 days, during which time the temple will be desecrated. Now, in other words, the temple's desecration will extend 30 days beyond the 3.5 year period, beyond the 1,260-day period. However, in Daniel 12:12, he says that those who manage to make it to the 1,335th day, which is now an additional 45 days to the 1,290, are now promised a unique blessing which could hardly be anything else but the millennium. So the fact that Daniel limits this interlude to 75 days means that there won't be enough time for all the events of Ezekiel to transpire. Second objection to this view is that it fails to give us a satisfactory answer to the problem of the 7 months and 7 years. 7 months of burial is a total of 210 days. This would mean that the burial would continue for at least 135 days into the millennium, depending on when during the interlude the invasion takes place. Again, this is not consistent with the massive scripture describing the millennium and Israel. And also added to this now are the 7 years of burning of the weapons, which make this view impossible. It cannot happen in the interlude. Then we have the end of the millennium view. This view places it at the end, this invasion at the end of the millennium. Now, main support of this view lies in making this invasion the same as the Gog and Magog invasion of Revelation 20, verses 7 to 9. Now, Revelation 27 to 9 does speak of an invasion of Israel after the millennial kingdom, and it does use the terms Gog and Magog. But again, this particular view is not adequate in dealing with all the issues raised by the Ezekiel passage. To begin with, the origin of the invasion in Ezekiel, as we said, is from the north, whereas the origin of the Revelation 20 invasion, the origin of the invasion, is from the four corners of the earth. So there's a difference between the two passages insofar as the origin of the invasion is concerned. Also, this view has a definite problem with the 7 months of burial, because it would mean burying the dead for 7 months into the eternal state or into eternity. Yet we read in Revelation 20 that immediately after the invasion, the presently existing earth is going to be done away with, and that leaves no place or time to be burying anyone. We also learn from Revelation 20 that after this invasion, all of the unsaved dead are to be resurrected from the dead to stand at the great white throne judgment. The question then is, you got to ask yourself the question, why bother spending 7 months to bury these dead when they're about to be resurrected anyway? It's a useless exercise. Why bother? Also, concerning the 7 years of burning, it would mean carrying this on into the eternal state, and this whole idea is just contrary to what we know about the eternal state from the last 2 chapters of the book of Revelation. And of course, Revelation 20 has already pointed out that the earth is going to be destroyed after this invasion. So neither it nor the weapons will be around for burning. In fact, there'll be no place to bury or burn. So neither is this view the best one. From these first 4 views we've just looked at, the key problem with all of them is the 7 months of burial and the 7 years of burning. Now, there's a 5th position which Dr. Fruchtenbaum favors because it deals adequately with these 2 periods. This is the pre-tribulation view, or to put it another way, this invasion will occur sometime before the tribulation starts. This is the pre-tribulation view. Now, we can summarize this in 3 statements. Pre-trib view states, well, it looks at it this way. First of all, Israel is to be established in the land before the tribulation and will be living in a state of security. Well, we can tick that box. Second, the Russian Confederacy invades Israel during this time of security and before the tribulation. Third, this confederacy is destroyed in Israel sometime before the tribulation. That is a basic pre-tribulation view concerning the Russian invasion. This is the best view because it answers all of the difficult questions. So now we're going to look at the various supports for this view, which can be summarized in 3 areas with a few addendums to those 3 areas. First of all, the description of Israel as we have seen it in these 2 chapters of Ezekiel fits the state of Israel as it now exists before the tribulation. Everything we read in Ezekiel 38 and 39 fits the way Israel happens to be right now. Here are some examples. First of all, Israel is a land that has been brought back from the sword. It was established by means of war and conflict in keeping with Ezekiel 38:8. Israel fought the War of Independence to gain its initial territory, gain more land as part of its territory as a result of the 6-day war. So it is indeed a land that is brought back from the sword, from war. Second, it's a nation gathered out of many nations and many peoples, in keeping with Ezekiel 38:8 and 38:12. The Jews in the land today have come back from somewhere between 80 and 90 different nations. Third, the continual waste places are now inhabited in accordance with Ezekiel 38:8 to 12. And Israel is indeed rebuilding the ancient places. The sites of ancient cities are becoming new and modern cities. And all over the country, you'll find the ancient names attached to modern towns and cities. Fourth, they're dwelling securely, as we looked at back in 38:11 and 14. Unfortunately, many people have interpreted the word securely to mean living in peace. And that's why they feel that Israel will never be living in peace until after the signing of the 7-year covenant with the Antichrist. Now, this, of course, then puts the peace factor somewhere in the middle of the tribulation. But reading through Ezekiel 38:1 to 39:16, you'll not find the word shalom or peace used even once. The word secure or security is used, but that is not the same as peace. The word does not mean peace. The Hebrew word here is betach, B-E-T-A-C-H, which means security, not necessarily because of a state of peace, but because of living in a state of confidence in one's own strength. And certainly today, that is very characteristic of Israel today, living in a state of confidence in her own military might. The various actions Israel has taken, as in the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the bombing of back in the 1980s of the Iraqi reactor, among other events, has been Israel showing her state of confidence in her military power. She is indeed a country dwelling securely. Today, Israel is being attacked on, I think, about 6 fronts. Fifth, they're dwelling in unwalled villages, in keeping with chapter 38:11. So this is what we saw. The kibbutzim and the moshavim in Israel fit this description quite well. So the first main support behind this view is that Israel is a land today exactly as described in these 2 chapters. This fits how Israel is at the present day before the tribulation. Now, the second main support for this view lies in where Russia is today. Russia is still a superpower in spite of the recent demise, recent history, that is, of the communist Soviet structure, also before the tribulation. The rise of Russia to be a global power coincided with the establishment of the State of Israel. Today, Russia also has the wherewithal and the know-how to launch an invasion of the type described in this particular passage. Third line of evidence is that it provides the best answer to the questions relating to the 7 months of burial and 7 years of burning. To show why this is the best answer, we need to review some of the other positions, why the other positions do not provide adequate evidence. Now, first of all, to put this invasion at the beginning of the tribulation, although it leave no problem with the 7 months of burial, it would present a problem for the 7 years of burning, which would have to extend throughout the whole of the second half of the tribulation, when Israel is fleeing the land and so is no longer in the land to burn these weapons. And second, to put the invasion in, we're just looking back at the previous ones, okay? To put the invasion in the middle of the tribulation would mean that the 7 months of burning would extend to the second half, and the 7 years of burning would also extend for 3.5 years into the kingdom. And as we saw, there are problems with this view because the Jews are outside the land. And third, put the invasion at the end of the tribulation presents a problem for both periods, the 7 years, 7 months, because both would then extend right into the millennial kingdom. Fourth, to place it in the interlude period would mean that both periods would extend into the millennial kingdom. Fifth, to put it at the end of the millennium would mean both periods would have to extend into the eternal order, and this could not be squared with what we know about the situation from other scriptures. So the best way of dealing with the problem of the 7 months of burying and the 7 years of burning is to place this invasion at least 3.5 years before the tribulation begins. It could be even longer, of course, who knows, but at least 3.5 years or more before it starts. So that would present no problems whatsoever with the 7 months of burial. Neither would it present any problems with the 7 years of burning, because if it occurs only 3.5 years before the tribulation starts, then they'd burn the weapons for 3.5 years before the tribulation and during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. And so with Israel still in the land during that time, it would allow them to burn these weapons for the entire 7 years. Now, of course, the invasion could happen 5 or 10 or more years before the tribulation starts. We don't know. And that would present no problem with either the 7 months or the 7 years. Now, for this reason, this is why Dr. Fruchtenbaum happens to believe that this is the best view as to the timing of this invasion. Now, there are some objections to this view. The first objection states that the Ezekiel 38 to 39 passage is part of the restoration section of Ezekiel, and that's true. It is in that section, but the question is, which restoration? Which restoration is Ezekiel describing? The partial in unbelief or the final in faith? It would seem that Ezekiel is speaking of the partial restoration in unbelief, because faith begins in Israel only after the Russian invasion and after the divine intervention and destruction of the invaders. So the restoration in faith is covered by Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48. The second objection, and the one most commonly used, is that dwelling safely or securely, as used in the Old Testament, always refers to millennial peace and security, something that Israel will not receive before the tribulation. Now, while the term dwell securely is indeed used of life in the millennium, this is true only of the minority of verses and not at all true of the majority of verses. Jeremiah 49:31 as a reference is particularly significant because it uses the very same Hebrew phrases that are found in Ezekiel 38:11. The phrase to dwell securely is used more often in non-millennial contexts than in millennial ones. That was a second objection. The third objection states that before the tribulation view contradicts the doctrine of imminency. However, stating that something must precede the tribulation is not the same as stating that it must precede the rapture, unless it is further stated that the rapture begins the tribulation. Remember, the act that begins the tribulation is not the rapture, but the signing of the 7-year covenant. And therefore, the before the tribulation view asserts that the Russian invasion will occur before the signing of the 7-year covenant. And now, this does not contradict the doctrine of imminence, because the rapture may still come even before the invasion. We know it comes before the tribulation, but it might even come before the invasion. So the rapture continues to be both imminent and pre-tribulational. It can occur at any time between now and the signing of the 7-year covenant. It does not mean that the rapture begins the tribulation. So then to say that the Russian invasion will take place before the tribulation does not negate imminency, since it is not the rapture which begins the tribulation. Now, could the rapture have come before 1948? Well, yes, it could have, because the rapture is imminent. Could the tribulation have come before 1948? The answer is no, because there was no Jewish state and government to sign the covenant which would begin the tribulation. Now, a fourth objection states, how could Israel apostatize so soon after the nation experienced a revival? Well, this raises a counter question. Why should this even be a problem? Have a look through the Old Testament history. Israel often apostatized very quickly after a revival. Book of Judges. There was speedy apostasy of Israel following the various miracles of the Exodus and the recognition of God at Sinai. There was speedy apostasy after the revivals of Hezekiah and Josiah. So there's no problem with it happening again. It's in their DNA. A fifth objection states that the Russian invasion will happen in the latter days and years. Ezekiel 38:8 tells us this. And this expression simply applies to the whole period of the end times when prophecy is again being fulfilled. And so it can be very easily applied to the closing days of the church age as well. And this is a position of a pre-tribulational invasion, but not a pre-rapture invasion. And the sixth and final objection states that Israel will not gain any title to the land, nor have the right to return until she signs a covenant with the Antichrist. Well, Israel has possessed the title of the land since God made his covenant with Abraham. Also, the United Nations recognized Israel in 1948, and the Jews have had the right to return and have been returning since then. So in what way could signing the covenant with the Antichrist give the Jews the right to return to the land that United Nations did not? Israel's right to return will not be based on a covenant with the Antichrist any more than it is based on the full recognition by the United Nations. The scriptures predict a regathering before the tribulation in unbelief in preparation for judgment. It is God who is doing the moving, and it is God who is bringing the Jews back into the land. And this is enough for Israel's right to the land. The covenant with the Antichrist will hardly give Israel any additional right to return. Israel is back in the land before the tribulation, and hence the Russian invasion could easily take place before the tribulation. So if we combine the scriptural facts and the answers to objections raised to the pre-tribulational view, Dr. Fruchtenbaum concludes that this is the best position by far to take. Russian invasion, we're going to see, it's another one of those, we spoke about them, the birth pangs which will occur before the tribulation begins. Now, the campaign of Armageddon, and we're going to have the great feast. Now, verse 17 to 20. And you, son of man, thus says the Lord Jehovah, speak unto the birds of every sort and to every beast of the field. Assemble yourselves and come. Gather yourselves on every side to my sacrifice that I do sacrifice for you, even the great sacrifice upon the mountains of Israel, that you may eat flesh and drink blood. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, and of goats, of bullocks, all of them fatlings of Bashan. You shall eat fat till you be full, and drink blood till you be drunken of my sacrifice, which I have sacrificed for you. And you shall be filled at my table with horses and chariots, with mighty men and with all men of war, saith the Lord Jehovah. Now, this passage here deals with the great feast of Jehovah. And in verse 17, God issues a call, and you, son of man, thus says the Lord Jehovah. Now, it's been the tendency of most Bible expositors and commentators when they commentate in these two chapters to connect verses 17 to 29 with what preceded it in chapter 39, 1 to 16. But actually, it's dealing with two separate events. In fact, the very way verse 17 begins, and you, son of man, thus says the Lord Jehovah, is a formula which we see in Ezekiel for the introduction of a new prophecy. So verse 17 and onward is not to be connected with Ezekiel 38, 1 to 39, 16. Because whereas in the previous segments, when Ezekiel started out by saying, son of man, thus says the Lord Jehovah, immediately Gog or Magog was mentioned. But here, Gog is not mentioned with the introductory phrase, son of man. For example, in 3 previous places, this formula was used. Back in 38 verse 2, we see son of man, introducing a new section, set thy face toward Gog. 38:14, son of man, prophesy and say unto Gog. 39:1, and you, son of man, prophesy against God. So in the 3 previous passages where the phrase son of man was used to introduce a new prophetic section, Ezekiel was told immediately thereafter to address Gog. But now when we get to chapter 39, verse 17, however, a new prophetic section is introduced with the same phrase, son of man. But God doesn't tell Ezekiel to address Gog anymore. Therefore, we're dealing with a brand new section which is being kept distinct from the previous Gog section. Now, as we already noted, by the end of chapter 39:16, the 7 months of burial have been completed. By the end of verse 16, the armies of Gog have been buried. The various bones have been found and buried. But then from verse 17 onwards, we're now dealing with bodies which are still exposed. And as we look at parallel passages which describe the same thing, we find in verses 17 to 20, for example, those other passages clearly put this event in the campaign of Armageddon. Isaiah 34:6-7, Zephaniah 1:7-8, and also more precisely, Revelation 19, verses 17-18 and verse 21. So then, these exposed bodies, which are now being fed to the birds and the beasts, have nothing to do with the bodies of Gog and Magog, which by the end of verse 16 have been buried in a specific valley. Rather, these are the same bodies mentioned by Isaiah, Zephaniah, and John in Revelation, of men who were killed in the campaign of Armageddon. Verse 17 and onwards follows Israel's final salvation and restoration, which is something that comes after Armageddon. So the object of this call of God in verse 17 is that Ezekiel should speak to two groups of animals. First of all, speak unto the birds of every sort, and second, to every beast of the field. So Ezekiel is told to give a message to them. And the message is, assemble yourselves and come. Gather yourselves on every side to my sacrifice that I do sacrifice for you, even a great sacrifice upon the mountains of Israel. So the purpose of this gathering together of birds and animals is so that you may eat flesh and drink blood. So they're invited to partake of a sacrifice. And indeed, the same kind of idiomatic language is used by Isaiah and Revelation, where all of these dead human bodies are looked upon as a sacrifice for the birds and animals. Whereas in the past, the animal kingdom served to supply sacrifices for the human kingdom, now the roles are reversed. The roles are now reversed. In verse 18, he describes the feast itself. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty and drink the blood of the princes of the earth. He then gives some specific descriptions of the mighty and the princes of the earth in terms of various kinds of sacrificial animals. These rams, lambs, goats, and bullocks, they're all figures for various ranks of soldiers which have now been killed. All of them fatlings of Bashan. Bashan, which is situated today in the Golan Heights, is famous for its fine pastures and well-fed cattle. So this picture of Bashan as being the great place of wealth of cattle and so on is given in Deuteronomy 32:14. Deuteronomy 32:14, Psalm 22:12, and Amos 4 verse 1. Amos 4:1. So the emphasis here is that these are the cream of the crop of humanity that has now been killed and serve as a sacrifice for the animals. And verses 19 to 20 talk about the satisfaction these animals as they gorge, the satisfaction of these animals as they gorge themselves on dead human flesh. Verse 19 deals with the concept of fat and blood. You shall eat fat till you be full and drink blood till ye be drunken. And the place where this will happen is the place of my sacrifice, which I have sacrificed for you. And the expression fat and blood normally denoted the holy portions which were always reserved for God under the Mosaic law. And we see this in Leviticus 3 verse 16, Leviticus 7 verses 22 to 27, Leviticus 17, 10 to 14, and Ezekiel, which we'll see later on, Ezekiel 44:15. Now, whereas in the case of animal sacrifices, the fat and the blood were the holy portions and always reserved for God, in this case, the fat and blood of humans is freely given over to the animal kingdom so that they can become filled and drunk with it. And then in verse 20, Ezekiel now deals with the soldiers again. You shall be filled at my table. It is my table because God is the one who's providing the food. And this at this feast for the animal kingdom, it is his table. And the courses of this meal include horses and chariots, with mighty men, and with all men of war. So this is the great feast that will be given to the animal kingdom as a result of the campaign of Armageddon. And in next section, we're going to come to the second smaller unit in verses 21 to 24, where Ezekiel now spells out the reason for Israel's judgment. So, thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong. See you next week.